Our next speaker has plenty of insights to offer. Paul Muckleston joined Microsoft in 1986. He's held a variety of senior roles around the world, appointed New Zealand Managing Director in July 2010. He's a board member of the New Zealand Technology Industry Association. Of course, it collaborates with businesses, associations and communities and government to promote the use of information and communications technology. We will hear now for some perspectives. Please welcome Paul Muckleston.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Andrew. All right, so I'm between you and lunch. Who's hungry? All right, we'll try and get back on time. The brief that I was given was to spend a little bit of time thinking a bit about, what are some of the trends that business leaders are telling us that they're experiencing, stepping back, thinking about how we're experiencing a lot of that in our personal lives. What are these mega trends that are going to be shaping the future over the next 5 to 10 years? And then I'll give you a couple of insights over how those are impacting different businesses, Microsoft being one of those, in terms of forcing us to sort of radically rethink the organisation, what we need to be doing, our mission, our purpose, etc. Where is the clicker? Here's the clicker. So I guess I'd start off with saying that, it really is just at the beginning. The technology industry as we know it has only been around for sort of 30 odd years. And if you step back and you have a look at what happened at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution and how many years have passed since then, we're sort of seeing, we think, the beginning of another sort of third stage of economic development. And we think it really is just the very, very, very beginning of something that's going to continue to accelerate and grow at a really rapid rate over the years ahead. And when you think about where we are, when I say it's just the beginning, look, we've all got devices. We've had search for 10 years, but if you think about how we're, for example, using search, we still use a little tiny text box, and we put in what we want to search for. It comes back with 10 links. The ranking of those links are a bit like what it was back in high school, in that you're either really popular or your parents had a lot of money to make you popular. And so a lot of the data on the internet is kind of hidden for us. And if you think about the apps, we've all got our smartphones here. I guarantee you that if you all put out the 20 apps that you've got, there'd be the vast majority that only one or two of you would actually have in the room. So there's also apps that have got functionality that you know about that somebody else could use. And if you don't happen to stumble across that app in the top 10 versions of that app, how are you ever going to find it? So we're really just starting. If you think about what the future might look like, and I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, used to watch things like the Jetsons, and I think by now we're all supposed to be living in big tall towers, running around in our flying cars, or Star Trek with things like teleportation and things like that. But if you actually look at where some of the core technologies have got now, we're actually not that far away from what previously would have been considered science fiction. And so if we think about, and I think about, what does the near term look like? And I'm talking maybe 3 to 5 years' time. How are you all going to be experiencing technology in your private life, and what's the implications for that for you as business people in terms of how you think about your customers and how you're going to engage with people? And I think there's a few things that are going to be certain. One is you're going to have a very deeply personal assistant. And if you think of the best executive assistant that you've ever had in your life or that your boss has ever had, and you think about what that person did for the boss, and what it meant was that over time that assistant got to really learn the habits, the behaviours, the likes, the dislikes. They could preempt things, they knew when to sort of advise you to do stuff. That's exactly where the technology is heading to. The personal technology, the truly personal digital assistant, is really going to understand all of your moves. It's going to know what you've been doing from your diary. It's going to understand your GPS locations. It's going to know your preferences. And it's going to increasingly help you maximize what we think will be the one precious and scarce thing that's left in the technology industry, and that's human attention and human time. Because the price point and the capability of technology is just sort of a big race to the bottom at the moment in terms of the stuff that you can get today and the stuff that you can get tomorrow. It's no longer going to be a cost thing. It's going to be about how does all this tech go enough into the background that you can actually get on with your lives and be more productive as a result. And therefore the context of what you're doing is going to become a lot more important in terms of things like personal digital assistants and apps. We're going to talk about this in a bit more detail, but you're going to have a plethora of everything will be networked, everything will be connected. There's literally going to be trillions of sensors out there within the next 10 to 15 years, all generating data. It's going to be around you. Computing is going to be pervasive. And you're going to be speaking conversationally with your tech, in a tone and a language and a slang that you want to talk to. It's going to understand you 100%. It's going to be able to understand your body movements, your facial expressions. A lot of that technology is already out there now with some of the Kinect sensors that we brought out with Xbox, a little $100 sensor. It's got 3 3D cameras in there. It can tell whether you blinked your left or your right eye at 5 meters away from the gaming console. And increasingly, we've just done something else too around something we call Skype Translate, which is a service we're launching in a few months, which you'll be able to have a Skype video call. You can be speaking French, they can be speaking Chinese, and it's going to be translating in real time, trying to sync even the translation to the movement that it sees on your lips. And that's a free service. And so it wouldn't be that far down the track to think you're going to be able to have a little earbud in your ear when you're talking to someone from a different country that's going to have real-time language translation. And so some of those barriers are also going to go down. And the other thing I think you're going to find also is that increasingly, all surfaces will be able to be an interactive surface that you engage with. And that's using things like the really small micro projectors that are out there. It's using things like the smart camera technology so it can look at how you're interacting with a wall and infer what your movements are. And so the interesting thing with that, what I'm talking about, is none of that stuff needs to come out of the labs. It's already out of the labs and it's existing in pockets, whether it's in gaming or in various other different industries. And so, it is just starting. It's really, the end of the beginning phase of technology. Who knows where it's going to take us, but it's certainly going to be very exciting. Now, if we think about this in terms of what's on the mind of business leaders living today, and if you particularly look at some surveys that were done recently of 1,000 CEOs in the US and Europe, what were the top things that really came to mind? And surprisingly enough, these top things relate really closely to technology. The first one of those, and I will use slightly different language to talk about the same thing, is everybody talks about wanting to enhance and change the customer experience. Mobile technologies, social media, etc., are completely changing expectations of customers in every industry in terms of how they expect to engage with companies and really forcing companies to rethink about how they make that experience much more engaging. Where the sources of a lot of that engaging is coming from is if you look at some of the outperforming enterprises at the moment, they're 54% more likely to be in collaborative engagement with their customers, and they're also significantly more likely to be using third parties and partners to help them generate and differentiate their products and their services. The second thing that's happening is pretty much every industry that you talk to, every chief executive that I talk to in New Zealand and anywhere else for that matter that you read about, within about 5 minutes of talking, they're always using the word transformation. And it's not just sort of buzzword bingo, it's kind of real. Pretty much every industry is going through some form of radical transformation. They're either being transformed themselves, they're being disintermediated by somebody else. It's a huge shift, and it's much more than what we all did 10 years ago, which was simply to say, great, transforming to a digital business means sticking up a website and now people can buy stuff from us online. Or we're just going to digitize our old clunky business processes and say that we've transformed. It's much, much more than that. It's really radically rethinking how do you differentiate your product or your service, and what does it really mean with all the potential that we're talking about in this digital world. And the first two kind of lead to the third one, which is it's really forcing us all to become a hell of a lot more responsive to customers. And there again, that's just not saying that you're doing some social media monitoring so you can find out when someone said something bad about you and you can engage with them on Twitter. That's kind of table stakes. It's really thinking that if customers are expecting to engage with you directly, they're expecting you to fix things much, much, much faster than they ever did before. And increasingly, real brand loyalty is when you create the opportunity to sort of almost co-create the product with the customer where their data and yours becomes unique and actually makes that service you've got really sticky so they're less likely to change. But it also means that increasingly customers, and not just big customers, consumers, you and me as consumers, are really expecting we're going to get to that holy grail of sort of a segment of one, where a customer knows you as an individual and what you want and how you do things. And that's forcing a huge amount of change right across business. If we then think about this from a consumer perspective, how do we spend our lives? And the reality is we've all got different roles that we have, parent, brother, sister, son, worker, boss, sports person, etc. And we all have these quite, nice but now somewhat antiquated notions of how we sort of spend our time, and we talk about things like work-life balance. And the reality is it's incredibly chaotic, and we're doing a million different things in a year, and often in a day, we're doing many different things less than a minute at a time. You know, we're working one moment, we're playing the next, we're looking for information, we're buying something, we're switching all these roles. And the reality is technology hasn't quite caught up with that yet. So another way of looking at this is a flow of a typical business manager, you know, gets up at 6:15 in the morning, has this mix the whole time between, in this case, his commercial activities and his consumer activities. And the reality is today that all the devices we've got, they don't talk to each other particularly well. Most of the apps aren't aware that when you finish working on one app, you go to another. And often the connection between how you work at work digitally and the expectations you have in your consumer life are radically different. And in a lot of cases, you've got a much better tech experience in your consumer life than what you have when you go into your business. So clearly there's a lot of room for improvement, but all these different actions that we have in a day are sort of driving, I think, a rethink of how we need to be looking at services that are able to track us and work with us across the different things that we do, but also really important that we get the privacy and the security aspects of this right as well. So if we step back and we go, well, then what are some of the trends? So I've spoken about what's on CEOs' minds, how we sort of experience tech now that we have these smartphones and things in our lives. What are the big trends that pretty much everybody in the tech industry agree are going to continue to shape us for the next sort of 5 to 10 years? And I'll just touch on those briefly, some of which you've no doubt already heard about today and some of the previous sessions. But what's kind of interesting with these things is that they're all happening at once. They're all incredibly interconnected and interrelated. And it also means that as a business, you've got to kind of figure out how to deal with all 5 of these things concurrently, which is pretty confronting and pretty demanding. And collectively, they're leading to what we think is probably a 10 to 20 year shift in the percentage of GDP that's spent on technology in pretty much every economy in the world as more businesses digitize and as things like the Internet of Things come along, that increasingly this stuff is just going to become even more significant than it is today. When we talk about things like cloud, the economics behind cloud computing are what's really going to make this a reality. And what a lot of industry commentators are talking about now is that in the next 5 to 7 years, it's quite likely there's going to be 3 sort of major companies globally that basically become the platform for business. Where you're going to run your business, where you're going to use your apps. And those are people like Microsoft, they're people like Google, they're people like Amazon. And between the 3 of us, we're literally investing tens of billions of dollars a year in building out the cloud capability that's necessary to do this. And the price of these services is dropping through the floor. And so the economics to a business of being able to get basically supercomputing time for 10 cents a day and to be able to spin up a new business and consume technology and turn it off when you finish and only pay for the few hours that you've used it, I think is going to become so irresistible to businesses that we're just going to have to figure out a lot of the security and the privacy and the data sovereignty concerns and some of the other things that we've spoken about today. To put it in perspective, we've just got one service that we run of the many services we run called Azure, which is a platform where developers can build and run their software applications and businesses can run things like their SAP apps. We've lowered the pricing of that service 35 times in the last 14 months, at the same time as we've invested over $3 billion in building out the data center capability. And so a lot of the stuff, it's like a race to the bottom in terms of the pricing. And the service itself, in this case just Azure from Microsoft, we've got 200 different cloud services. We've announced and released major new functionality and capability in that platform every 3 days for the last 18 months, and we're expecting to take that to a daily release. And those aren't small things like a text box on the screen. It's things like machine learning. It's things like Internet of Things management services and a lot of the big data things that we've spoken about. So the pace of this is quite exciting, but it's also, I think there's a lot of unintended consequences behind this. For example, even a year ago, if you wanted to have some personal cloud storage, you'd go along to someone like Dropbox and the going rate was about $100 US a year for 200 gigs of storage in the cloud. And then there's been a race to the bottom in cloud storage. And so in the last 6 months, for example, we've gone from offering you, I think it was 20 gigs with an Office 365 subscription to 50 gigs to 1 terabyte of free data a month ago. And then earlier this week, we've said, right, it's unlimited. You can put as much as you like on there. And that's covered in a subscription for another service. And so effectively, that whole business that was there before, in this case around cloud storage, has just been disintermediated as the big cloud service providers just assume that storage is just something that you're going to want and we're going to monetize it through other ways. And so all this stuff is changing really, really quickly. And the cloud stuff, the scale is pretty massive. I mean, in quite recently, was recent as I think last year, the number of servers in the Microsoft and Amazon data centers was larger than the total number of servers in the world in 2007. And the data that some of the other people have talked about here too is just insane. There's more data stored in a single Microsoft data center than there has been written in all of human history. And we've got 19 of these data centers, and we're just one of the big players. And so the scale behind this is incredible. On the mobility side, last quarter I saw globally there was over 330 million smartphones shipped, just in a 3-month period. And that's in a planet with a population of 7 or 8 billion people. And if you look even in New Zealand with our 4 million people, this year alone there's 1.2 million smartphones, there's 600,000 PCs, 500,000 tablets and 100,000 gaming consoles, well over 2 million internet connected devices shipping in 12 months in a country with only 4 million people. And so this sort of collision of lots of devices, lots of sensors, cheap cloud storage is all sort of feeding off of itself and creating more change. And then social is something we haven't spoke that much about, I think, today, but the advent of social and enterprise social is also radically changing a lot of things. It's changing how customers expect to interact with businesses. It's changing how, if you hire millennials, how they expect to be able to work in the workplace in terms of that transparency and the ability to question anything. And the tools in behind that are really driving the ability for you to be able to respond a lot faster to your customers. There's massive money to be made behind this. There's fortunes being generated. Facebook, that didn't even exist 10 years ago, has got a market cap now of over 100 billion US, and that market cap is built on data that you've given to them for free. And then if you look at what they did recently in terms of leveraging their market cap, they bought a company called WhatsApp. Now WhatsApp, for those of you who don't know, they've got about 450 million people have downloaded their comms app. It's a bit like Skype with a few other things thrown in. That company had 39 staff and hadn't yet done over US $10 million in revenue. And they were sold last month or 2 months ago to Facebook for $17 billion US. There's a mixture of stock and cash. And so fortunes are being made on this expectation that if you get the right social tools and you get the right data, you're going to be able to monetize it in some way. Underlying all of this is the security and privacy concerns that we just heard about before. And some of those are pretty scary, although personally I'd love to be a chief executive that could just ring up my assistant and say, please wire $1 million to buy my latest painting. That would be fantastic. I'll be willing to take on some risks for that. But we do spend a lot of time talking about hardening systems for security, but then you've only got to look at the damage or the great public good, depending what your political belief is, of what Edward Snowden did to the US defense industry. And he was a contractor. He was one of 1.2 million people in the US that had top-level security clearance. And so you can have the best systems in the world, and it can take one person that decides they're going to take your data and share it with other people for good or for bad reasons. And all of those other policies can be circumvented. So a little bit about the trends that we're seeing at an industry level. Briefly, just on Internet of Things, why is this different? What's new about it? I think what's different about it is the scale. So the numbers that we talk about, and if you read 10 reports, you'll get 10 different numbers. But roughly 2 billion internet connected devices today, 5 billion smartphones, 7 billion people. In the next 10 years, roughly 50 billion internet connected smart devices, and ranging anywhere from estimates of 200 billion to 10 trillion sensors that will be sort of in every aspect of our lives, whether it's looking at security in our food chain or our clothing. And what's driving this is the intersection of things we've mentioned, mobility, cloud, etc., big data, but it's also the cost. There's a law in the computer industry called Moore's Law, which suggests that every 18 months the power of computing will double and the cost of producing that computing will halve. And that law has been in operation roughly now for about 25 years. Doesn't look like there's any sign of it slowing down. And so if you go to Texas Instruments at the moment, you can buy 10,000 Wi-Fi chips for less than $150 US. And so the chip technology is going so cheap now, some of these things are fractions of a cent, that you can start to do some pretty amazing things on really tiny little bits of tech that are incredibly powerful in terms of their battery life and make use of a lot of the networks that are there. So that's sort of the next thing that's coming. What are we doing as a company to kind of, react to the fact that the strategic context for us as a business has changed significantly? And so we now define ourselves as, thinking about the future from a technology perspective as this sort of mobile-first, cloud-first world. And we've got a new CEO, we're changing a lot of things about our business. The reality of this is that this explosion that we think is going to continue of mobile devices and Internet of Things and cloud feeding more data and insights, and the big shift that's coming in GDP, we think there's an amazing opportunity, not just for ourselves, but we think for the whole tech industry in the years ahead. And so we've sort of redefined our mission and our purpose as a company. And we're saying that how we guide a lot of our decisions now internally is saying, look, we want to be this productivity and platform company for this mobile-first and cloud-first world. And we believe that we've got clarity of purpose and a pretty bold aspiration to reinvent productivity to empower every organisation and every person on the planet to do more and be more. Now that's a pretty bold, lofty aspiration, but I tell you it's something that's guiding a lot of the decisions that we're now making as a company in terms of realising that for us to be successful in this future, we've got to be relevant, and for us to be relevant, we've got to move much faster, and we've got to change so many things about how we do our business. So just as I wrap up to close, some of the signs of this transformation that you're seeing if you happen to be close to a company like Microsoft, and many of our competitors are going through big changes too, is pretty fundamental. So I'll just quickly touch on a few of these things. We invested over $4.5 billion US last year in our cloud capability. That means we consume more than 5% of the world's global server production just in our own data centers. And we're expecting to increase that investment over the next 12 months. These things are massive, and they've usually only got 1 or 2 people in them that actually run them. The whole thing's automated, it's lights out. It's pushing through a lot of boundaries in terms of green technology, because power then becomes one of the number one costs of your business, so you want to make those things run as efficient as possible. We've moved from having 3 to 5 year product life cycles for something like Office to, with Office 365, we do major releases every 30 to 90 days now. And that's had to force a huge change in how we build software, having the right metrics in place, the right listening mechanisms to find out what's working, what's not working. If something's not working and a user doesn't like the feature, you've got to change that, you've got to put it back out there. It's a huge shift. And as I mentioned, things like Azure, which is our cloud platform, we're now doing major releases every 1 to 3 days in terms of additional capability in the platform. We recently acquired Nokia. We acquired them for a couple of reasons. One, we think it's important to have a first-party device experience. Secondly, it comes with a lot of expertise around supply chain and manufacturing, and it also comes with 20,000 of the core mobility patents that are out there as well. We recently took things like Office and realised, well, if our future isn't really tied to the PC anymore and it's tied to these potentially billions of devices, we want to light up experiences for people, digital work and their digital life experiences across all devices, obviously not just our own. And so we recently launched Office for iPad. We've had now 50 million downloads. It's been sort of top of the Apple App Store in the US for something like 9 weeks running. And it just shows, I think, the way that the company's starting to think about it. And it's not a poor cousin to the PC experience. If you've got it on your iPad, you'll know it's been designed for an iPad-like experience, but it's also an Office experience. And we'll be doing something similar for Android and other things too. And so just to finish, the little band there that I just thought I'd talk to, and this came up on Monday when I was writing notes for the speech, we just entered the wearable space. And the reason why I think that's interesting is because, to close my presentation, it touches on a lot of the themes that I've been talking about and that you've heard from other people. This little device came out earlier this week. It sold out in the first couple of days. It's a little fitness band. It's got 10 different sensors on there. It retails for $199 US. It's got gyroscopes on there. It's got 3 different accelerometers in it. It's got a UV sensor. It's got a heart rate monitor. It's got a GPS built in there. It can even look at the wetness of your skin as a proxy for how much that you're sweating. It comes with a whole lot of apps on there that are connected to the cloud. And when we launched it, we also launched it as an open reference platform. We've made it completely open to other manufacturers to take the same tech and build on it, because the prize for us is getting the cloud services there around a centralised and personalised health record. And it's using things like big data. And so what it's going to do in the next generation when we release the update in a few months' time is not only will it monitor sleep levels and fitness and things like that, and things like the gyrometer can sort of work out with the accelerometer what you're doing. If you're doing push-ups or things like that, it knows the sort of movement signs of what that looks like. But what's really interesting is it'll start to integrate your calendar information if you want it to. And it'll look at your sleep behaviour, it'll look at your calendar behaviour, it'll figure out what other fitness stuff you've done, then it'll start to give you advice and say, hey, I notice that when you have more than 6 meetings in a day, or if you work at Jackie's company, when you have a meeting with Jackie, your heart rate goes through the roof and you don't sleep very well. So either avoid meetings with Jackie or make sure you get a good night's sleep beforehand. And so it's kind of interesting because from a Microsoft perspective, it's very much on new strategy. It's a mobile-first experience, it's cloud-based. It's making advantage of the cost of these sensors, it's Internet of Things. It's social in terms of being able to share the information, and it's using big data and analytics in the back end. And who knows whether it'll be successful or not, but it's a play to sort of prove a point and prove an approach. So to finish, leave you with a few questions that I was thinking of when I was writing this. Probably more from you in your role as businesses, but also as humans consuming technology as well. How are you going to balance privacy versus functionality versus value? And the reality is today, most consumers are willing to give away a certain amount of privacy and security in exchange for free stuff. And especially when you think about some of the products where you actually are the product. How are we going to feel about that in the future? And do you think there's going to be more of a shift towards wanting to take control and ownership of your data, and potentially being even willing to pay for that if you've got a different level of assurance of how that data is used? At some point in the not too distant future, the amount of machine-to-machine traffic on the internet is going to surpass the amount of computer-to-person traffic on the internet. And who knows where all this will lead to and the unintended consequences that will come with that. For us in the software industry, the real challenge is how do you keep people at the centre, realising that the most important thing we're going to have to all do in the future is be able to give time back to people, to not be intrusive. Think about how you market to your customers today. And think about how time-constrained we all are. I mean, who even watches TV anymore, let alone consumes television advertising? And so, how are you going to maximise people at the centre and respect for human attention and human time? There's going to be significant job elimination, and a lot of that's going to happen in the educated middle classes. And there's also going to be a whole lot of new types of jobs that are created. We were talking recently about the need potentially for boards to have a chief data scientist that actually starts to think about one of the last points there, if data is the new oil and suddenly you can ask questions that before nobody could do unless they had a supercomputer for 10 cents, what are the questions that you're going to ask? And how should you be thinking about what those questions mean to how you're going to be able to drive your business in the future? And then the last point there is really around this personalisation of your service to the individual and finding out, how do you understand your customers in a very different way? And in a perfect world, how can you sort of co-create some digital value with a customer because they're giving you some data, you're mixing it with yours, you're creating some new value, and you're coming up with a service that's really sticky, so you're going to be able to retain that customer in the future and not have them switch to somebody else. So, thank you very much for your time.